In the spring of 1943, a German intelligence officer in Berlin received a routine report from an Abwehr agent operating deep within the United States. The document contained no troop movements, no factory coordinates, no military secrets. Instead, it described something far more unsettling, the contents of an ordinary American supermarket. Shelves overflowing with fresh meat, sugar without ration cards, chocolate bars stacked in abundance, fruits from distant states arriving daily. The officer read it twice, certain there had been a translation error. But there was no mistake. While German housewives queued for ersatz coffee and sawdust bread, American civilians shopped as if there were no war at all. The revelation was so shocking that the report was immediately classified. Not because it revealed Allied strength, but because it exposed the terrifying truth. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the enemy it was fighting. Berlin, January 1942. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht conference room hummed with the confidence of men who believed victory was a matter of time. General Oberst Franz Halder spread intelligence reports across the mahogany table, each one reinforcing the Reich's strategic assumptions about their newest adversary. The United States, freshly dragged into the war after Pearl Harbor, appeared to German military planners as a nation of contradictions, industrially capable, perhaps, but soft, undisciplined, and critically vulnerable to the demands of total war. The assessment was not without logic. German intelligence had meticulously documented America's peacetime economy, a consumer paradise built on automobiles, refrigerators, and Hollywood fantasies. The Abwehr's pre-war reports painted a picture of a nation addicted to comfort, where workers demanded high wages and short hours, where strikes paralyzed industries, and where the very concept of sacrifice seemed alien to the national character. "They build cars, not tanks," one analyst had written dismissively. "Their factories produce washing machines, not weapons. When rationing begins, when the luxuries disappear, their society will fracture." This conviction was rooted in Germany's own experience. The memory of World War I's Steckruben winter, the turnip winter of 1916–17, haunted German strategic thinking. The Allied blockade had starved the home front, triggering riots, strikes, and ultimately contributing to the Kaiser's abdication. The lesson seemed clear. Modern industrial warfare was won or lost, not just on battlefields, but in the kitchens and factories of the home front. A nation that could not feed its people, that could not maintain civilian morale while simultaneously arming its military, would inevitably collapse from within. The German High Command believed America faced an impossible equation. To field a military force capable of challenging the Wehrmacht, the United States would need to convert its entire industrial base to war production. This meant shutting down automobile plants, appliance factories, and consumer goods industries. It meant imposing draconian rationing on a population that had never known deprivation. It meant asking civilians to sacrifice their standard of living for a war being fought thousands of miles away. "The Americans will produce tanks," General Major Reinhard Gehlen predicted in a February 1942 briefing, "but their supermarkets will empty, and when they do, their political will shall crumble." The strategic implications were profound. If America's home front could be destabilized, if civilian morale could be broken through the inevitable hardships of total war, then the Reich could win a war of attrition even against superior numbers. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic not just to sink military convoys, but to strangle the flow of goods that kept American civilians comfortable. Abwehr agents were dispatched to the United States with orders to monitor not troop movements, but grocery stores, gas stations, and factory towns. The mission was to identify the breaking point, the moment when American society would crack under the pressure of wartime scarcity. But the agents who arrived in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles in early 1942 encountered something their training had not prepared them for: Hans Müller, an Abwehr operative posing as a Swiss journalist, filed his first report from Manhattan in March 1942 with palpable confusion. "The stores remain full," he wrote. "Meat, butter, sugar, all available without significant restriction. The restaurants serve steaks that would feed a German family for a week. There are lines for certain goods, yes, but nothing resembling genuine shortage. The people complain about rationing, but their complaints are those of inconvenience, not desperation." Muller's report was not an anomaly. From Detroit to San Francisco, German agents sent back similar observations. The expected collapse of American civilian abundance had not materialized. Instead, something unprecedented was occurring. The United States was simultaneously arming the largest military force in its history while maintaining a standard of living that seemed almost obscene to European eyes. The contradiction defied every principle of wartime economics that German planners understood. The initial response in Berlin was skepticism bordering on disbelief. Surely the agents were being deceived, shown only what the Americans wanted them to see. Surely the abundance was concentrated in wealthy urban centers, while the heartland suffered. Surely it was propaganda, a facade that would soon crumble. General Major Galen ordered his analysts to cross-reference the field reports with other intelligence sources. Intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, neutral observer accounts. Every source confirmed the same impossible reality. The problem was not that Germany lacked information about American industrial capacity. Pre-war economic data was readily available. Steel production figures, agricultural output statistics, manufacturing capabilities. But German analysts had made a fatal error in interpretation. They had assumed that wartime conversion would follow the European model, that military production would necessarily cannibalize civilian consumption, that guns would come at the cost of butter. They had failed to grasp the sheer scale of American productive capacity, the vast agricultural surplus, the logistical infrastructure that could simultaneously supply armies overseas and supermarkets at home. By summer 1942, the cognitive dissonance within German intelligence had become acute. The Abwehr possessed detailed reports of American factories producing aircraft at rates that exceeded Germany's entire annual output. Yet those same reports described workers driving new cars to those factories and shopping in stores stocked with goods that had vanished from German shelves years earlier. It was as if the Americans had discovered a form of economic alchemy, transmuting industrial might into both military power and civilian prosperity. The strategic implications were beginning to dawn on the more perceptive German officers. If America could sustain both its military and its home front indefinitely, if civilian morale remained unshaken by the demands of war, then the entire premise of German strategy was flawed. The war of attrition could not be won. The home front would not collapse. The Americans would simply outproduce, outship, and outlast the Reich. But acknowledging this reality meant confronting an unbearable truth, that Germany had entered a war it could not win, against an enemy whose strength had been catastrophically underestimated. And so, throughout 1942 and into 1943, German intelligence reports accumulated in Berlin filing cabinets, detailed, accurate, and increasingly alarming accounts of American abundance. They were read, analyzed, and then, more often than not, rationalized away. The supermarkets must be propaganda. The abundance must be temporary. The collapse must be imminent. It was not imminent, and in the spring of 1943, when that classified report landed on the desk of a German intelligence officer, describing an ordinary American supermarket in extraordinary detail, the illusion could no longer be maintained. The Americans were not suffering. They were not sacrificing. They were winning, and they were doing it while eating better than German generals. Washington, D.C., December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had transformed the United States overnight from a reluctant observer into a fully committed belligerent. Within days, President Roosevelt's administration faced a challenge of staggering complexity: how to mobilize an entire continental economy for total war without triggering the social collapse that German strategists confidently predicted. The task fell to an unlikely coalition of New Deal bureaucrats, corporate executives, and agricultural experts who understood that modern warfare would be won not just with tanks and planes, but with calories, logistics, and the psychological resilience of 130 million civilians. The War Production Board, established in January 1942 under the leadership of former Sears executive Donald Nelson, immediately confronted the central paradox of American mobilization. The nation possessed unprecedented industrial capacity: steel mills, automobile factories, chemical plants, but converting this infrastructure to military production while maintaining civilian morale required a delicate balance that no nation had ever successfully achieved. The Soviet Union had militarized its economy through brutal coercion and mass starvation. Britain survived on American aid and draconian rationing that reduced civilians to subsistence diets. Germany's own economy teetered on the edge of collapse, sustained only by the systematic plunder of occupied territories. America would attempt something different: total war without total sacrifice. The strategy was born not from humanitarian sentiment, but from cold political calculation. Roosevelt's advisors understood that American democracy, unlike totalitarian regimes, could not simply command obedience. Workers could strike, voters could rebel. A hungry, resentful population could paralyze war production more effectively than any Luftwaffe bombing campaign. The home front had to be maintained not as a necessary evil, but as a strategic asset. The agricultural sector became the first testing ground for this unprecedented experiment. Claude Wickard, Secretary of Agriculture, faced an assignment that seemed mathematically impossible: increase food production to feed both a rapidly expanding military and allied nations, while ensuring that American civilians experienced minimal disruption to their diets. Pre-war America had been a land of agricultural abundance, but that abundance was unevenly distributed and inefficiently utilized. Wickard's team calculated that the nation would need to increase total food production by at least 30%, while simultaneously losing millions of farm workers to military service and war factories. The solution emerged from an unlikely source: the same industrial principles that Henry Ford had applied to automobile manufacturing. American agriculture would be mechanized, standardized, and scaled to unprecedented levels. The government poured resources into tractor production, chemical fertilizers, and hybrid seed development. The number of tractors on American farms increased from 1.6 million in 1940 to over 2.4 million by 1945. Each tractor replaced the labor of multiple workers while dramatically increasing yield per acre. Corn production, critical for both human consumption and livestock feed, jumped from 2.5 billion bushels in 1940 to over 3 billion bushels by 1944. But production was only half the equation. The food had to reach consumers efficiently without the bottlenecks and black markets that plagued European nations. This challenge fell to an emerging sector that would prove as strategically important as any weapons factory: the American supermarket industry. In 1942, supermarkets were still a relatively new phenomenon, having emerged only in the previous decade. Chains like Safeway, A&P, and Kroger had pioneered a revolutionary retail model: large format stores with centralized purchasing, efficient inventory management, and self-service shopping that reduced labor costs while increasing customer throughput. The Office of Price Administration, led by economist Leon Henderson, recognized that these supermarket chains could serve as the distribution backbone for a rationed but abundant food system. Unlike the small neighborhood grocers that dominated European retail, American supermarkets possessed the infrastructure to handle complex rationing schemes while maintaining the appearance and largely the reality of plenty. The system they devised was ingenious in its complexity. Certain goods would be rationed through a point system, but the rations would be set high enough that most families experienced inconvenience rather than genuine deprivation. Simultaneously, unrationed goods would be kept in abundant supply, ensuring that store shelves never appeared empty. The implementation, however, tested the limits of American organizational capacity. In May 1942, sugar rationing began. The first major test of the system. Each American was allocated half a pound of sugar per week, a reduction from pre-war consumption but hardly starvation. The supermarket chains had to implement a point card system across thousands of stores, train staff to verify rations, and manage inventory to prevent hoarding. The first weeks were chaotic. Lines stretched around blocks. Clerks struggled with the paperwork. Some stores ran out of sugar entirely, while others had surplus, but the system adapted with remarkable speed. Supermarket executives, applying the same efficiency principles they had used to revolutionize retail, streamlined the rationing process. Within months, the initial chaos had resolved into a functioning system. More importantly, the stores maintained abundant supplies of unrationed goods. A shopper in June 1942 might wait in line for sugar, but would find meat, vegetables, bread, and dairy products readily available. The psychological impact was profound. Rationing existed, but abundance persisted. The meat industry presented a more complex challenge. American civilians consumed meat at levels that shocked European observers, an average of 140 pounds per person annually, compared to less than 50 pounds in most European nations. Maintaining anything close to this consumption while feeding millions of soldiers seemed impossible. Yet the government's strategy was not to drastically reduce civilian meat consumption, but to increase production while implementing selective rationing that preserved the perception of plenty. The solution involved a massive expansion of livestock production, particularly pork and poultry, which could be raised more quickly than beef cattle. Between 1940 and 1944, pork production increased by over 70%. Chicken farming, previously a small-scale operation, was industrialized with stunning speed. The number of chickens raised commercially increased from 34 million in 1940 to over 60 million by 1945. Simultaneously, the government implemented a rationing system that limited each person to about 28 ounces of meat per week, a reduction from pre-war levels, but still more than double what German civilians received. The supermarkets became theaters of a carefully orchestrated performance. Butcher counters displayed a rotating selection of cuts, ensuring that while a specific item might be unavailable on a given day, alternatives were always present. A customer seeking beef might find pork chops instead, or chicken, or lamb. The variety created an impression of abundance, even within the constraints of rationing. Store managers were trained to arrange displays strategically, placing unrationed goods prominently to minimize the visual impact of rationed items. By autumn 1942, the system was functioning with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. German agents filing reports from American cities struggled to convey the reality to their superiors in Berlin. How could a nation at war maintain such abundance? The answer lay in a combination of factors that German planners had failed to anticipate: the sheer scale of American agricultural capacity, the efficiency of industrial farming methods, the sophisticated distribution networks of the supermarket chains, and a rationing system designed to manage perception as carefully as it managed supply. But the system was not without its strains. The winter of 1942-43 brought the first serious challenges. Transportation bottlenecks emerged as the military commandeered ships and rail capacity. Certain goods, coffee, imported fruits, some canned goods, became genuinely scarce. Black markets emerged in major cities, though on a far smaller scale than in Europe. Labor shortages in food processing plants led to temporary disruptions. Some supermarkets in smaller towns struggled to maintain inventory levels. The government responded with characteristic American pragmatism. They threw money and resources at the problems. Transportation was reorganized to prioritize food shipments alongside military cargo. Food processing plants received draft deferments for key workers. The supermarket chains were given preferential access to supplies in exchange for maintaining price controls and rationing compliance. By spring 1943, the system had stabilized once again. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that the American food system was not a facade maintained through propaganda, but a genuine achievement of industrial organization and agricultural productivity. The supermarkets were not showpieces for foreign observers. They were the actual mechanism by which 130 million Americans were fed with remarkable efficiency. The abundance was real, sustainable, and strategically decisive. In March 1943, an Abwehr agent named Friedrich Weber entered a Safeway supermarket in Philadelphia with orders to document the reality behind the propaganda. He spent 2 hours methodically cataloging what he saw: 47 different varieties of canned goods, fresh meat at the butcher counter despite rationing, produce sections stocked with vegetables from California and Florida, bakery sections offering fresh bread and pastries, dairy cases filled with milk, butter, and cheese. His report, filed through a neutral courier to Berlin, concluded with a sentence that captured the strategic implications. If this is how the enemy's civilians eat during wartime, we have fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the conflict we are fighting. Berlin, April 1943. The intelligence reports arriving at Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitzufer had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with established doctrine. Oberst Georg Hansen, head of Abwehr Section Schön, intelligence gathering, sat in his office surrounded by folders marked "Streng Geheim," top secret. Each contained field reports from agents operating in the United States, and each told the same impossible story. The Americans were not suffering. Their home front was not collapsing. Their supermarkets remained stocked with goods that had vanished from German stores years ago. Hansen was a career intelligence officer, trained to distrust convenient narratives and seek uncomfortable truths. But the reports before him challenged every assumption upon which German strategy had been constructed. He had personally briefed General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel on the findings, watching the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command's face shift from skepticism to irritation to something approaching alarm. "Your agents are being deceived," Keitel had declared. "The Americans are showing them what they want them to see. No nation can simultaneously arm millions of soldiers and maintain such civilian abundance. It defies economic logic." But Hansen knew his agents were not being deceived. The reports were too consistent, too detailed, too mundane in their observations to be fabrications. Friedrich Weber's account of the Philadelphia Safeway had been corroborated by separate reports from agents in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. All described the same phenomenon: supermarkets operating with an efficiency and abundance that seemed to mock the privations endured by German civilians. The cognitive dissonance within German military intelligence was becoming acute. The Reich's entire strategic framework rested on the assumption that modern industrial warfare required total mobilization, that military production necessarily came at the expense of civilian consumption. Germany itself had implemented this model ruthlessly. By 1943, German civilians endured severe rationing: 250 grams of meat per week, 200 grams of bread per day, ersatz coffee made from acorns, margarine instead of butter. The Nazis had stripped occupied territories to supplement German rations, yet shortages persisted. How then could the Americans maintain abundance while simultaneously outproducing German factories? The answer, had German analysts been willing to accept it, lay in a fundamental miscalculation about American economic capacity. Pre-war intelligence had accurately documented American industrial output, but had failed to grasp the implications of that output. The United States in 1940 produced more steel than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Its agricultural sector generated surpluses so vast that the government had spent the 1930s paying farmers to reduce production. Its transportation infrastructure, railroads, highways, inland waterways, could move goods across continental distances with an efficiency that European nations could not match. German economic doctrine, shaped by the experience of World War I and the autarkic policies of the Nazi regime, assumed that national economies operated at or near maximum capacity. Mobilization meant redirecting existing production, sacrificing butter for guns. But the American economy in 1940 had been operating far below its potential capacity, still recovering from the Depression. Mobilization did not require sacrifice. It required activation of dormant capacity. Factories that had stood idle were reopened. Farmland that had been left fallow was cultivated. Workers who had been unemployed were hired. The American economy did not contract to support the war effort, it expanded. This reality was incomprehensible to German planners who had spent a decade constructing an economic system based on scarcity management. Major Reinhard von Stief, a Wehrmacht staff officer, articulated the confusion in a memo circulated among senior commanders in May 1943. The intelligence reports from America describe an economic model that contradicts fundamental principles of wartime mobilization. Either our understanding of industrial economics is flawed, or the Americans have discovered methods of production and distribution that render our own strategies obsolete. Neither possibility is acceptable. The reports were particularly unsettling, because they came not just from Abwehr agents, but from multiple independent sources. German prisoners of war, repatriated through neutral countries, told stories of American camps where food was so abundant that prisoners gained weight. Neutral diplomats and journalists returning from the United States confirmed the supermarket observations. Even intercepted American communications, letters from soldiers to families, civilian correspondence, spoke casually of shopping trips and restaurant meals that would have been unimaginable luxuries in Germany. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht convened a special analysis committee in June 1943 to assess the strategic implications. The committee included economists, logistics experts, and intelligence officers. Their task was to determine whether the reported American abundance was sustainable or whether it represented a temporary condition that would inevitably collapse under the strain of prolonged war. The committee's findings, delivered in a classified report in July 1943, were deeply troubling. American agricultural production had increased by 35% since 1940, despite the loss of farm workers to military service and war industries. Industrial output had more than doubled. The transportation system, far from being overwhelmed, was operating more efficiently than in peacetime due to centralized coordination. Most critically, there was no evidence of civilian unrest, no indication that the American population was approaching a breaking point. The report concluded with an assessment that few in the Wehrmacht leadership wanted to hear. The United States has demonstrated the capacity to sustain both military mobilization and civilian consumption at levels that exceed our previous estimates by an order of magnitude. The assumption that American home front morale would collapse under wartime privation appears to have been fundamentally incorrect. The enemy's economic model is not comparable to European systems and cannot be analyzed using conventional frameworks. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through German military circles. Officers who had confidently predicted American collapse now faced the prospect of an enemy that could not be exhausted, could not be starved, could not be broken by attrition. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, which had been partly justified as a means of disrupting American civilian morale by creating shortages, was revealed as strategically irrelevant to that objective. Even if every merchant ship carrying goods to America were sunk, the domestic production capacity was sufficient to maintain civilian abundance. Some officers refused to accept the implications. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, dismissed the intelligence reports as American propaganda successfully infiltrating German channels. "They want us to believe they are invincible," he argued in a heated staff meeting. "They want us to despair. But no nation can defy the laws of economics. Their abundance is a mirage, sustained by debt and propaganda. When the true costs of this war come due, their society will fracture." But others, particularly those with direct experience observing American industrial capacity, recognized the truth. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, had access to detailed intelligence about American factory output. In a private conversation with Hitler in August 1943, he attempted to convey the scale of the challenge. "Mein Führer, the Americans are producing aircraft at a rate of 8,000 per month. Our entire annual production is less than 40,000. And they are doing this while their civilians drive automobiles and shop in stores that our people can only imagine." Hitler's response was characteristic. He blamed the intelligence services for defeatism, insisted that American production figures were exaggerated, and declared that German willpower would overcome material disadvantages. The Führer's refusal to accept reality cascaded down through the command structure, creating an environment where accurate intelligence was dismissed as pessimism and wishful thinking was elevated to strategic doctrine. Yet, the reports continued to arrive. In September 1943, an Abwehr agent in New York filed an account of visiting a supermarket in Queens, where housewives complained about the terrible inconvenience of rationing while filling shopping carts with meat, vegetables, canned goods, and fresh bread. The agent noted with bitter irony, "They consider it a hardship to be limited to 2 pounds of meat per week, more than a German family receives in a month. Their definition of sacrifice is unrecognizable to European standards." The perplexity within German intelligence was compounded by the realization that American abundance was not concentrated in wealthy urban areas, but distributed across the nation. Reports from agents in rural Kansas, industrial Detroit, and agricultural California all described similar conditions. The supermarket system had proven remarkably effective at distributing goods across vast distances, ensuring that even small towns maintained access to a variety of foods that would have been considered luxuries in wartime Europe. By late 1943, the strategic implications were undeniable to those willing to see them. Germany was fighting an enemy that could not be defeated through attrition, could not be demoralized through privation, and could not be exhausted through prolonged conflict. The American home front was not a vulnerability to be exploited. It was a source of strength that rendered traditional strategies of economic warfare obsolete. The final bitter irony was that German intelligence had accurately identified and reported this reality. The failure was not one of information gathering, but of institutional willingness to accept information that contradicted ideological assumptions. The reports sat in filing cabinets, read by officers who understood their implications but lacked the authority or courage to force a strategic reassessment. And so the war continued, with German planners clinging to the belief that American abundance must inevitably collapse, even as every piece of evidence demonstrated the opposite. Washington, D.C., November 1943. The American food distribution system, which had functioned with remarkable efficiency for nearly 2 years, faced its gravest crisis. The combined demands of Operation Overlord planning, the Italian campaign, and the Pacific island hopping strategy had created unprecedented strain on the nation's transportation infrastructure. Ships, railroads, and trucks were being commandeered for military purposes at rates that threatened to sever the supply lines feeding American supermarkets. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the system that German intelligence had watched with such bewilderment appeared vulnerable to collapse. The crisis manifested first in the transportation bottlenecks of autumn 1943. The War Department's insatiable demand for shipping had diverted vessels that normally carried agricultural products from California to East Coast markets. Refrigerated rail cars, essential for transporting meat and dairy products across continental distances, were being requisitioned to move military supplies. Truck tires, rationed since 1942, had become so scarce that some rural distribution routes were being abandoned. By October, supermarkets in northeastern cities were experiencing genuine shortages for the first time, not of rationed goods, but of fresh produce, dairy products, and regional specialties that had previously been taken for granted. The Office of Defense Transportation, led by Joseph Eastman, confronted a problem that threatened to vindicate every German prediction about American home front fragility. Internal projections suggested that without immediate intervention, civilian food distribution would deteriorate by 30 to 40% over the winter months. Supermarket chains were already reporting inventory problems. In Boston, a Safeway manager filed an urgent report. Produce section half empty for 3 consecutive days. Customers asking questions, morale impact visible. Similar reports arrived from Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York. The political implications were severe. The 1944 presidential election loomed, and Roosevelt's administration could not afford images of empty supermarket shelves. More critically, the industrial workforce, the men and women producing the tanks, aircraft, and munitions that were winning the war, depended on the promise that their families would be fed. A collapse in civilian food distribution could trigger labor unrest that would cripple war production more effectively than any Luftwaffe bombing raid. The solution emerged not from government bureaucrats, but from an unlikely alliance between supermarket executives and logistics innovators who had been quietly revolutionizing American supply chain management. Roy Dawson, vice president of operations for the Kroger chain, had spent the previous year studying military logistics methods and adapting them for civilian use. His insight was radical. The supermarket system could not simply wait for goods to arrive through traditional distribution channels. It needed to become an active participant in the transportation network, coordinating directly with producers and creating alternative supply routes that bypassed the congested main arteries. Dawson's team developed what they called adaptive sourcing, a system that treated each supermarket not as a passive endpoint, but as a node in a dynamic network that could shift suppliers based on transportation availability. If California produce couldn't reach Boston due to rail shortages, the system would redirect the Boston stores to source from Florida or Texas, even if it meant carrying different products than originally planned. If refrigerated transport was unavailable, the stores would shift to canned and preserved goods that could travel via standard freight. The implementation required technological innovation that pushed the boundaries of 1940s logistics management. Kroger installed a centralized coordination center in Cincinnati, equipped with telephone banks and detailed transportation maps. Operators tracked rail schedules, shipping routes, and truck availability in real time, redirecting orders dynamically to avoid bottlenecks. The system was primitive by later standards. No computers, no digital communications, but revolutionary for its time. Within weeks, other supermarket chains were implementing similar systems, but adaptive sourcing alone could not solve the transportation crisis. The physical shortage of rail cars, ships, and trucks remained. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the agricultural sector itself. Farmers and food processors, facing the prospect of rotting crops due to transportation failures, began organizing their own distribution networks. In Iowa, a cooperative of pork producers purchased a fleet of surplus trucks and hired drivers to deliver directly to supermarket distribution centers, bypassing the congested rail system entirely. In California, fruit growers chartered small coastal vessels to ship produce to Pacific Northwest markets, creating new supply routes that had never existed in peacetime. The government, recognizing the strategic importance of these innovations, provided critical support. The War Production Board authorized the production of additional refrigerated trucks specifically for civilian food distribution, a decision that required diverting resources from military vehicle production. The Office of Defense Transportation granted priority routing status to food shipments, ensuring that civilian supply trains received scheduling preference on critical rail corridors. These decisions were controversial within the military establishment, where officers argued that every resource should be devoted to combat operations. But civilian administrators understood that maintaining home front morale was itself a military necessity. The winter of 1943-44 became a proving ground for the resilience of the American food system. Supermarket managers, accustomed to predictable inventory flows, had to become improvisational experts. A store in Pittsburgh that normally stocked California oranges would suddenly receive Florida grapefruit instead. Butcher counters that had featured beef would pivot to pork or chicken based on what transportation could deliver. The variety that had characterized American supermarkets gave way to a more utilitarian abundance. Shelves remained stocked, but with whatever products the adaptive system could efficiently deliver. The psychological management of this transition was as important as the logistics. Supermarket chains launched customer education campaigns explaining that while specific products might be temporarily unavailable, alternatives would always be provided. Store managers were trained to emphasize abundance rather than scarcity. "We have plenty of chicken today," rather than "we're out of beef." The messaging was carefully calibrated to maintain the perception that the system was functioning normally, even as it was being fundamentally restructured behind the scenes. The crisis reached its peak in January 1944 when a severe winter storm paralyzed rail traffic across the Midwest for nearly 2 weeks. The disruption threatened to create genuine shortages in eastern cities just as the system was stabilizing, but the adaptive network proved its worth. Supermarket chains rerouted supplies through southern rail corridors, increased truck transport despite fuel rationing, and coordinated with local producers to source goods regionally. A Safeway in Newark, cut off from its normal California suppliers, sourced vegetables from New Jersey farms, dairy from Pennsylvania, and meat from local processors. The store's shelves remained stocked, though with a product mix that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. By February 1944, the crisis had passed. The transportation system had not collapsed, it had evolved. The supermarket chains had demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that surprised even their own executives. More importantly, they had maintained the appearance and largely the reality of abundance through the most severe logistical challenge of the war. American civilians had experienced inconvenience. Their favorite products were sometimes unavailable, variety was reduced, but they had not experienced genuine deprivation. The German intelligence officers monitoring these developments struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. An Abwehr report from February 1944 noted with frustration, the American distribution system experienced severe disruption in winter months, yet supermarkets remained operational and adequately stocked. The enemy has demonstrated a capacity for logistical adaptation that exceeds our analytical models. Their civilian supply network exhibits characteristics of military-grade resilience. The innovations born from crisis became permanent features of the American food system. Adaptive sourcing, direct producer-to-retailer relationships, and dynamic transportation routing would continue to evolve in the post-war years, laying the groundwork for the modern supply chain management systems that would define late 20th century retail. But in 1944, these innovations served a more immediate purpose. They ensured that the American home front remained unshaken, that factory workers remained fed and productive, and that the German prediction of civilian collapse remained unfulfilled. In March 1944, Roy Dawson received a commendation from the War Production Board for his contributions to maintaining civilian morale. The citation noted that his logistics innovations had contributed materially to the war effort by ensuring the stability of the home front during a period of critical strain. Dawson, a modest man uncomfortable with recognition, remarked to a colleague, "We just made sure people could buy groceries. Turns out that's as important as building tanks." He was more right than he knew. The supermarkets, stocked through ingenuity and relentless adaptation, had become a weapon of war, not through any direct military application, but by demonstrating to friend and foe alike that American society possessed a resilience that could not be broken by the ordinary pressures of wartime mobilization. The shelves remained full, and with them, the American will to fight remained unshaken. Berlin, June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy had shattered any remaining illusions within the German High Command about the trajectory of the war. But for the intelligence analysts at Abwehr headquarters, the military defeat on the beaches of France was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper strategic failure that had been evident for months. The Americans had not simply outfought the Wehrmacht, they had outproduced, outsupplied, and outsustained the Reich in every dimension of industrial warfare. And nowhere was this disparity more symbolically devastating than in the contrast between the American supermarket and the German ration queue. Oberst Georg Hansen sat in his office reviewing the latest intelligence summaries from agents still operating in the United States. The reports had taken on an almost surreal quality, describing an American home front that seemed to exist in a different reality from the one Germans inhabited. In June 1944, as German cities burned under Allied bombing and civilians survived on 250 grams of bread per day, American supermarkets were advertising summer abundance sales, featuring fresh strawberries, multiple cuts of meat, and imported coffee that had begun flowing again as Allied naval supremacy secured the shipping lanes. The psychological impact on German morale, both military and civilian, was profound and corrosive. Soldiers returning from the eastern and western fronts brought stories of American prisoners of war who expressed genuine bewilderment at the conditions in German camps, not because the camps were particularly harsh, but because the rations provided to prisoners were inferior to what they had eaten as civilians. A Wehrmacht lieutenant captured near Caen and later repatriated through a prisoner exchange told his debriefing officers, "The American soldiers spoke casually of their families shopping in stores with more food than I have seen in Germany since before the war. I thought they were lying, engaging in propaganda, but they spoke with such casual certainty, such lack of awareness that they were describing something extraordinary that I began to believe them." At home, the intelligence reports confirmed these accounts with devastating precision. An Abwehr summary from July 1944 compiled data from multiple sources. American civilian meat consumption remains at approximately 120 pounds per capita annually, compared to German civilian consumption of approximately 25 pounds. American sugar rations, while reduced from pre-war levels, exceed German rations by a factor of 3. Fresh produce availability in American markets is reported as abundant by all observers, while German civilians subsist primarily on potatoes and preserved vegetables. The disparity is not marginal, it represents a fundamental difference in industrial and agricultural capacity. The reports were circulated among senior Wehrmacht officers, many of whom read them with a growing sense of despair. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, remarked bitterly to his staff, "We are fighting an enemy that feeds its civilians better than we feed our soldiers. What does this tell us about the sustainability of our position?" The question was rhetorical, but the answer was inescapable. Germany was losing a war of attrition against an opponent whose resources were effectively limitless. The demoralization extended beyond military circles into the civilian population. By mid-1944, German civilians had access to foreign radio broadcasts despite Gestapo prohibitions, and the contrast between Allied descriptions of life in America and their own daily struggles with shortages created a profound psychological crisis. A Sicherheitsdienst (SD) internal report from August 1944 noted, "Civilian morale continues to deteriorate. The population increasingly questions official narratives about enemy weakness. Reports from foreign broadcasts describing American abundance are widely discussed and increasingly believed. The effectiveness of domestic propaganda is diminishing." The supermarket had become, in the minds of German civilians and soldiers alike, a symbol of everything the Reich had promised but failed to deliver. Nazi ideology had proclaimed German superiority, German efficiency, German destiny to dominate Europe. Yet the reality was that German housewives queued for hours to receive rations of ersatz coffee and sawdust extended bread, while American housewives, according to the reports that circulated through whispered conversations and forbidden radio broadcasts, shopped in stores stocked with genuine coffee, fresh meat, and chocolate bars. The propaganda ministry, led by Joseph Goebbels, attempted to counter these narratives by emphasizing American decadence and moral weakness. Newsreels portrayed American abundance as evidence of a soft, materialistic society that would crumble when faced with genuine hardship. But the propaganda rang hollow to a population that was itself experiencing genuine hardship, while the supposedly weak Americans continued to thrive. A joke circulated in Berlin in autumn 1944. What is the difference between German strength and American weakness? About 100 pounds of meat per year. The military implications of this morale crisis were tangible. Wehrmacht units on both the eastern and western fronts showed increasing reluctance to engage American forces, not primarily due to fear of American combat prowess, but due to a growing conviction that the war was unwinnable against an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority. Desertion rates increased. Surrender rates, particularly on the Western Front, climbed steadily through late 1944. Interrogations of German prisoners revealed a common theme: the belief that American soldiers were better fed, better equipped, and backed by a home front that could sustain the war indefinitely. A particularly revealing interrogation report from October 1944 documented the testimony of a German NCO captured in France. "I have fought for 3 years on the Eastern Front and 6 months against the Americans. The Russians were brutal, but we believed we could defeat them through superior tactics and willpower. The Americans are different. They do not need superior tactics because they have unlimited resources. Every soldier knows that behind the American lines are factories producing endless supplies, and behind those factories are cities where civilians live better than our officers. How do you maintain fighting spirit against such an enemy?" The supermarket, in this context, became more than a retail institution. It became a weapon of psychological warfare, though one that operated without any deliberate design. The simple fact of American civilian abundance, documented by German intelligence and confirmed by returning soldiers, undermined the ideological foundations of Nazi resistance. If the master race could not feed its people as well as the supposedly inferior Americans, what did that say about the validity of Nazi racial theories? If German efficiency and organization could not match American industrial output, what did that say about German superiority? Albert Speer, in his capacity as armaments minister, had access to the most comprehensive intelligence about American production capacity. In a meeting with Hitler in November 1944, he attempted once more to convey the hopelessness of Germany's position. Mein Führer, the Americans are producing more military equipment in a single month than we produce in a year, and they are doing so while maintaining civilian living standards that exceed our own in peacetime. We cannot win a material war against such an opponent. Hitler's response was to dismiss Speer's assessment as defeatism and to insist that German willpower would prevail over American materialism. But even the Führer's most fanatical supporters were beginning to recognize the reality. The supermarket, that mundane institution of consumer capitalism, had become an inadvertent symbol of American victory, a daily demonstration that the United States possessed resources so vast that it could simultaneously crush the Wehrmacht and ensure that its civilians never missed a meal. By December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge represented Germany's last desperate offensive, the psychological war was already lost. German soldiers attacking through the Ardennes forest were motivated not by belief in victory, but by the hope that a temporary success might lead to a negotiated peace. They knew, because intelligence reports and returning soldiers had told them, that they were fighting an enemy whose home front was unshakable, whose industrial capacity was inexhaustible, and whose civilians shopped in supermarkets that would have seemed like fantasies to German families. The final bitter irony was that German intelligence had accurately predicted the importance of home front morale in modern warfare. They had simply been catastrophically wrong about which home front would collapse. The German prediction that American civilians would rebel against wartime sacrifice had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American economic capacity and organizational efficiency. The supermarkets remained stocked, the civilians remained fed, and the American will to fight remained unbroken. In January 1945, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east and American forces prepared to cross the Rhine from the west, Oberst Hansen filed his final intelligence assessment. The document, discovered in Abwehr archives after the war, concluded with a sentence that captured the essence of Germany's strategic failure. We underestimated not the American soldier, but the American supermarket. We believed that modern war required sacrifice, and we were correct. But we failed to understand that America's capacity for production was so vast that its necessary sacrifices were invisible to its civilian population. We fought an enemy that waged total war without experiencing total war, and against such an opponent we were doomed from the moment we began. Washington, D.C., May 1945. The war in Europe had ended with Germany's unconditional surrender, and across the United States, supermarkets that had maintained their shelves through 4 years of global conflict now prepared for the transition back to peacetime abundance. But the story of American food distribution during World War II had already transcended its immediate purpose. What had begun as a logistical necessity, keeping civilians fed while arming millions of soldiers, had evolved into a demonstration of systemic superiority that would reshape the post-war world order. The strategic significance of the supermarket system became fully apparent in the immediate aftermath of victory. As Allied forces occupied Germany, American soldiers encountered civilian populations on the brink of starvation. The contrast was so stark that it shocked even hardened combat veterans. Sergeant James Morrison, entering Berlin with the occupation forces in July 1945, wrote to his family in Ohio, "The German people are living on rations that wouldn't feed a dog back home. They look at our field rations, which we complain about constantly, like they're looking at a feast." When I told them that my wife back in Cleveland can still buy fresh meat at the supermarket, they thought I was lying. They literally cannot conceive of a nation that fought a global war without starving its people. The occupation authorities faced an immediate humanitarian crisis that required the very supply chain expertise that had kept American supermarkets functioning during the war. General Lucius Clay, appointed as Deputy Military Governor of Germany, recruited civilian logistics experts from American supermarket chains to help organize food distribution in the occupied zones. Roy Dawson, whose adaptive sourcing innovations had saved the American system during the 1943-44 crisis, found himself in Frankfurt in August 1945, applying the same principles to prevent mass starvation among the defeated German population. The irony was not lost on the Germans themselves. The supermarket executives, who had been the subject of Abwehr intelligence reports, were now organizing the distribution of American food aid through a shattered German infrastructure. Dawson later recalled, "We were using the same methods we'd developed to keep Kroger stores stocked in Cincinnati to feed people who had been trying to kill us a few months earlier. But that's what the situation required. You couldn't let millions of people starve, regardless of what their government had done." The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, represented the institutionalization of lessons learned from the American wartime food system. Secretary of State George Marshall and his advisors understood that European recovery required not just financial aid, but the reconstruction of efficient distribution systems that could deliver goods to civilian populations. The supermarket model, centralized purchasing, efficient logistics, standardized operations, became a template for modernizing European retail infrastructure. American consultants traveled to Britain, France, and Italy, teaching the principles of supply chain management that had kept American civilians fed during the war. The economic implications extended far beyond food distribution. The American demonstration that industrial mobilization did not require civilian sacrifice fundamentally altered post-war economic thinking. European nations, rebuilding from devastation, had assumed that reconstruction would require years of continued austerity and rationing. The American example suggested an alternative path, that economic growth and rising living standards could be achieved simultaneously with industrial development. This insight became foundational to the post-war economic order, influencing everything from the Bretton Woods system to the development of consumer capitalism in Western Europe. The supermarket itself evolved into a symbol of American prosperity and a tool of Cold War soft power. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the contrast between Western abundance and Eastern scarcity echoed the wartime contrast between American and German living standards. Soviet propaganda attempted to dismiss American supermarkets as capitalist decadence, but the message rang hollow to populations that remembered how American abundance had persisted even during total war. When Vice President Richard Nixon engaged in the famous kitchen debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, the discussion centered on supermarkets and consumer goods, a direct legacy of the strategic importance these institutions had demonstrated during World War II. The individuals who had built and maintained the wartime food system returned to civilian life with their contributions largely unrecognized by the broader public. Roy Dawson returned to Kroger, eventually becoming senior vice president before retiring in 1962. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime work, considering it simply a job that had needed doing. Claude Wickard, the Agriculture Secretary, who had overseen the unprecedented expansion of American food production, left government service in 1945 and returned to farming in Indiana. The supermarket managers, truck drivers, railroad workers, and farmers who had collectively sustained American abundance received no medals, no parades, no public recognition. yet their impact on the war's outcome was profound and lasting. The German strategic assumption that American home-front morale would collapse under wartime pressure had been based on sound historical precedent. Every previous industrial power had experienced civilian unrest when mobilization created shortages. The American food system had invalidated that precedent, demonstrating that sufficient organizational capacity and resource abundance could sustain both military and civilian needs simultaneously. This achievement had demoralized German military and civilian populations, undermined Nazi propaganda, and contributed materially to Allied victory. The post-war American supermarket bore the marks of its wartime evolution. The adaptive sourcing systems developed during the transportation crisis of 1943–44 became standard practice, allowing stores to respond dynamically to supply fluctuations. The direct relationships between retailers and producers, forged out of necessity during the war, persisted and deepened in peacetime. The efficiency standards and inventory management techniques refined under wartime pressure became the foundation for the modern retail supply chain. The supermarket that emerged from World War II was a more sophisticated, resilient, and efficient institution than the one that had entered it. Historians examining the war's outcome have traditionally focused on military campaigns, industrial production statistics, and strategic decisions. The role of civilian food distribution has received comparatively little attention, perhaps because it seems mundane compared to the drama of battlefield victories. But the German intelligence officers who monitored American supermarkets understood what many historians have overlooked: that modern industrial warfare is won not just by armies, but by the societies that sustain those armies. A nation that can keep its civilians fed, content, and productive while simultaneously fielding massive military forces possesses a strategic advantage that cannot be overcome by tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. The final assessment came not from American sources, but from the German officers who had witnessed the disparity firsthand. In his post-war memoir, Albert Speer reflected on the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed the Reich. We understood that modern war required total mobilization of industrial capacity. What we failed to understand was that America's industrial capacity was so vast that total mobilization still left surplus for civilian abundance. We measured our success by how much we could sacrifice. They measured theirs by how little sacrifice was necessary. In retrospect, the outcome was never in doubt. Oberst Georg Hansen, the Abwehr intelligence officer who had compiled the reports on American supermarkets, survived the war and was interviewed by American historians in 1952. Asked what single factor had most surprised German intelligence about American capabilities, he answered without hesitation, "The supermarkets. We expected military strength. That was predictable. We did not expect that a nation could wage global war while its civilians shopped as if there were no war at all. That was the revelation that told us we had fundamentally misunderstood the enemy we were fighting. By the time we realized our error, it was far too late." The American supermarket of 1945 stood as a monument to organizational efficiency, logistical innovation, and the power of abundance as a strategic weapon. It had not been designed for that purpose. It had evolved to meet the mundane need of feeding civilians during wartime. But in meeting that need with remarkable success, it had demonstrated a form of national power that transcended military might. The shelves remained stocked, the civilians remained fed, and the American way of war, total mobilization without total sacrifice, had proven decisively superior to the German model of victory through deprivation. In the decades that followed, as American supermarkets evolved into the hypermarkets and supercenters of the late 20th century, few shoppers pushing carts through fluorescent-lit aisles considered that they were walking through institutions that had helped win World War II. But the legacy persisted in the efficiency of the supply chains, the abundance of the shelves, and the fundamental assumption that American civilians should never have to choose between military strength and material comfort. The supermarket had become so thoroughly integrated into American life that its wartime role was forgotten, the ultimate testament to how completely it had succeeded in its mission. The story of how American supermarkets became an unexpected weapon of World War II reveals a profound truth about the nature of modern conflict. Wars are won not just by soldiers on battlefields, but by the societies that sustain those soldiers. While German intelligence officers watched in bewilderment, American civilians shopped in abundance, factory workers remained productive, and the home front never wavered. If you found this hidden chapter of history as fascinating as we did, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. What other aspects of the war do you think deserve deeper exploration? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue uncovering the remarkable human stories behind history's greatest conflict.